And if we return to our president, he recently stated that the Russian Federation's economy is not capable of sustaining the war at the previous scale. Do you agree with this statement?
Well, that's a complicated question. I wouldn't say that's absolutely true because Russia can continue the war. It's just that it will increasingly be financed at the expense of the population. As we just discussed, the population has started to feel a decline in their standard of living. This is the path the country will continue to follow. Russians didn't believe this for a long time. You can't imagine how many harsh words people wrote to me in various YouTube comments saying that everything is fine, we're living perfectly well. Now they've stopped writing so actively, they've quieted down. It's even strange, really, you almost miss them. Where did all those angry people go who used to tell me I was exaggerating everything? They've gone quiet somehow? Because what else can you do? It's winter, it's cold, there are countless housing and utility accidents. Was Lipchin predicting all this? How mean? Now you can't say he's wrong anymore. So that's exactly how the situation will be. In other words, the burden will ultimately fall on the population. Notice that Russia has clearly and completely given up on having a stable and reliable financial system. They have just published an official government forecast that extends up to the year 2042. What did they say there? That there will be no happiness until 2042. It's just like a prison tattoo on your chest. A lifetime without happiness. Now, they could get that tattooed right on the forehead of the finance minister at the Ministry of Finance because he's saying that until 2042, Russia will continue to have a budget deficit and they'll cover it by borrowing. That's why they're planning to raise Russia's domestic government debt to 200 trillion rubles.
Can you just explain what that means?
200 trillion rubles is roughly Russia's gross product. We're not ready for everything. So the debt to GDP ratio will be 100%. Not many countries in the world have such debts, Japan, the US, and a few others, but it's a heavy burden. At the same time, the debt is very large and expensive. Russia is borrowing money at 14 to 15% interest, while the US borrows at 4%. And this means that right now, the Russian government is laying a mine for the future lives of several generations. What do you mean, a mine? Let me explain. In order to pay off these debts, the Russian government incurs expenses. This is called, in official language, the cost of servicing the national debt. This means repaying old bonds that are due and paying out the income on them. After all, I'm taking 14 to 15% per year under the promise of income. So these payments today already make up about 9% of all budget expenditures in the Russian budget. And in total, that's already more than 3 trillion rubles. And probably it's not very clear what 3 trillion rubles actually means. Let me put this number into perspective. 3 trillion rubles is more than Russia earns in a year. It spends on all of healthcare and all of education. That's how much money it actually spends on paying off its old debts. And if these debts keep growing even more, as I mentioned earlier, up to an enormous sum of 200 trillion, then the next generation of Russians will have no choice but to do nothing except pay off these old debts from the past. And you can't just not pay them, because who buys these bonds? Russian banks. And they buy them largely using the population savings. So if these debts are wiped out, if a default happens, say, like in 1998, then the population's savings will disappear, the banking system will collapse, and so will the Russian population. They will end up just as destitute, poor, and barefoot as they were in the 1990s. But Russia is currently living according to this model, where there is no light at the end of the tunnel until 2042.
This has been officially stated. This is not Lipsits, this is official.
No, this is Russia's government.
Yes, for those watching us. So let's put it this way. Professor Lipsits assumed this. The government of the Russian Federation implied it. Yes, unquestionably, as they say. With a straight face, truly even saying that this is wonderful. It's wonderful, you see, just like how Putin said today that in 25 regions of Russia, demographics are steadily improving, consistently increasing, birth rates are rising, and so on. Although you and the statistics, even those from before the war, showed exactly the opposite trend. So look, how do you reconcile this? So it turns out that the future generation of Russians, whatever is left of them after the war, will be forced to pay off the national debt, while at the same time, the birth rate is catastrophically falling, despite the fact that today Putin was dancing the can-can and talking about how everything is wonderful. So how do you reconcile this, and how will it affect the population overall in terms of its size? Well, we've already understood the quality of life. So will Russia be a big country with a small population, or what? What will it actually look like?
Sometime in 2023, I recorded a series of lectures about the future of Russia and included materials from a demographic forecast for the year 2100. This caused an enormous wave, a wave of anger towards me, criticism, because these aren't my forecasts. These were provided by demographers, my colleagues, former colleagues from the Higher School of Economics. So according to this forecast, by the year 2100, Russia's population would have decreased by half, to about 70 million people. But this forecast is incorrect. It's activist in nature. It was written and calculated before the start of the war in Tall.
So
that means it doesn't take into account the casualties of war, war invalids, or emigration from the country. And today we say that the war has apparently pushed more than 2.5 million people out of Russia. These are the figures cited by Russian demographers, based on data about the number of residence permits issued in different countries. Russia does not provide such statistics. So, in reality, most likely the population will be smaller. People tell me, well, that's impossible. To try to guess so many years ahead what the population will be. I say, guys, why is it impossible? Just look around and try to understand what's happening around you. Google it. Babies born in 2025, and by 2100, they'll only be 75 years old like me. So we know how many such people there will be in Russia. We know how many children these people will have at the current declining birth rates, and how many people will die. In other words, over a 75-year horizon, we can more or less imagine what will happen. It could be worse. Maybe there will be fewer than 70 left, right? Maybe I'm being too, but it definitely won't get better. So then the question arises, there will be a lot of retirees, but who will be working to pay for their pensions? After all, in Russia, the pension system is based on intergenerational solidarity. That is, those who are working today contribute money, which is then used to pay the pensions of previous generations. So if there are fewer people working, their contributions become insufficient to pay out pensions, especially to the larger previous generation. Am I explaining this clearly? Now in Russia, this indicator is dropping sharply. At the same time, the Russian pension system used to have a certain safety margin. It was called the National Wealth Fund. But during the war, it was squandered. And there is about 4 trillion left unspent. That's peanuts. So Russians are facing a situation where there will be a problem with pensions. It will become very unclear, and how to solve it will be uncertain. And that's why, apparently, at first there will be delays in salary payments, and then anything could happen, up to and including raising the retirement age. People tell me that can't happen. I say, come on, Putin promised he wouldn't raise the retirement age. So what? Putin promised. That already just sounds like a joke. Of course, I agree, Tal. But people keep believing, well, how can I explain it to you? A person in Russia just can't believe that the president of the country is lying through his teeth. It's just something a Czech can't wrap his head around. He simply can't. So when I say the president is lying, they say, no, you're the one who's lying. Well, there's nothing I can do about it. That's just how Czechs are. But the president is lying through and through. He said he wouldn't raise taxes. But for 2 years in a row, he's been raising taxes in Russia. By the way, today during the live Q&A, this was also brought up by one of the entrepreneurs who complained that if this is introduced like VAT, then there's no point in working at all. Naturally, Putin said, I'll look into it. Well, yes, as they say, it's like water off a duck's back. Regarding who will be working in the Russian Federation in the near future, we know how many have been killed or wounded in the war, and so on. Plus, we remember the anti-migration policy. But at the same time, the total number of people who have been brought in, those who have actually arrived, yes, is something to consider. The number of migrants from India, if I remember correctly, increased to 17,500 in 2025. Why is that? I mean, I don't want to offend anyone, right? But for example, Tajiks, Kyrgyz, everyone, no, for now, everyone, no, you can't work here. But at the same time, they're bringing in migrants from India. Where's the logic in that? Why is it like this? And is it really true that in Russia there is simply no one left to work? I'm not even talking about earning money, just working at all. Well, overall, the situation in Russia is certainly very strange. From the outside, it's hard to make sense of it. People are starting to lose understanding of what's going on. But it's important to explain a very simple thing. There is no unified state power in Russia. As strange as it may seem, this so-called vertical of power is pure nonsense. It's just a bundle of sticks. It's not a steel vertical, it's a bundle of sticks where each straw tries to live its own way. That's why some of these straws are anti-migration, shouting that we shouldn't bring people in. For example, the Russian Orthodox Church is very strongly opposed to bringing in migrants. They say that this dilutes the nation's identity and will lead to Russia ceasing to be an Orthodox country. I can't listen to this calmly. No jokes here. In fact, according to what demographers and religious scholars tell us, after 1950, the number of Muslims in Russia will surpass the number of Orthodox Christians. The Russian Orthodox Church is afraid of this. That's why they try not to let people in from Central Asia, but they are trying to do it anyway. And then there are others, for example, those connected to construction. There too, serious people have invested serious money, but there's no one to work on the construction sites. And someone has to clean the cities. There's this tough city, St. Petersburg. There too, the streets need cleaning and snow has to be cleared from rooftops, but there's no one to do it. That's why now they've brought in Indians, so that Indians can clear the snow off the rooftops of St. Petersburg's buildings. Just picture that for yourself. It's a remarkable sight, but they're bringing them in. The plans are incredible. You're talking about some measly 17,000, but the government is planning to bring in between 800,000 and 1 million people from India. Then the question arises, how will this affect Russian attitudes? I understand this. I know it very well. I know one of those remarkable stories that few people are aware of, but I used to consult for Russian businesses. I remember how one company in the Moscow region decided to bring in people from Asia. I don't remember exactly, I think they were Vietnamese, but they understood that if they just settled them in the city, there would be terrible disasters, fights, massacres, God knows what could happen. So they built a closed-off settlement behind a wall, and the Vietnamese weren't allowed to leave this territory. They had shops there, I believe they even had a brothel, and they had a bar, but leaving the territory was forbidden so they wouldn't get killed or stabbed. This is to the point. They came in shifts, worked there for a couple of months, and then went back home. Back then, there were no murders. I'm just explaining what it looks like in Russia, so you understand what a disaster it is. Now they're going to bring in this huge number of Indians. How will all this mesh with the Russian population? How will people react, and what kinds of disasters, criminal ones, I don't know, will happen. But I think there will be some. There will be. I literally just remembered, a couple of days ago, there was a story at a school where I think a Kyrgyz boy was killed by a classmate, or at least by another student from the same school. It was for ethnic reasons.
For ethnic reasons. So there you have it.
Well, my dear, do you actually remember perhaps when African players came to play for Russian football teams and what was shouted at them from the stands?
By the spectators, perhaps?
No, I won't repeat it, but you can easily look up what kind of shouts were coming from the stands specifically directed at the black football players on Russian teams. All of this was happening quite actively.
Yes, but they're denazifying some other country for some reason. Of course, the Russian Federation. So it turns out that in Russia, there are no more practical, well, how come? Is there really a shortage of working age population? So it turns out they go off to war and do not come back, or they return but are unable to work. Is that correct?
Well, you have to understand that Russia really does have a very bad demographic situation. Strictly speaking, Russia has been losing its working age population since the 1970s, since the Soviet era. But while Central Asia was part of the USSR, the decline in the Russian regions, let's call them Russian regions, this was compensated by people from Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Central Asia. This was all clear. Now, these are all separate countries, and actually, by the way, they are starting to not want to come here anymore. Well,
of course, that's what's happening. Naturally.
Moreover, there's actually an interesting story. Not everyone knows this, but there's competition for people from Central Asia. Seriously? Yes, on the global labor market? Yes, exactly. Well, Russians themselves don't believe that Russia is some kind of land of milk and honey, and that everyone dreams of coming here to work for rubles. By the way, people from Central Asia are actively being brought to Southern Europe to work and taken to the UK to work as well. There aren't that many people who are willing to work for relatively little money in simple jobs in the world. That's why there's competition for labor in Central Asia. So, of course, it's better to go to the UK, get paid in pounds, and leave more or less peacefully than to come to Russia and risk getting caught in a masquerade, not knowing where you'll end up after that. That's why the flow is decreasing. And most Russians are old. Just understand, you say Russia is big, but everything is a lot. Let's pause for a second. Let's say 140 million people. It's probably actually less, but God
knows. I think it's already much less.
For now, I'll use that number. Out of them, 42 million are civilian pensioners. There are also military and security service retirees. We don't know how many of them there are. That's classified statistics, but just the civilian ones, 42 million. So as you can see, there are less than 100 million left who haven't reached retirement age yet. Then you subtract the disabled individuals, subtract the children, subtract those who are unable to work, and you're left with approximately 72 to 73 million people of working age. You then start subtracting people for the war, and all of this really starts to be felt. So that's the picture. At the same time, Russia's labor market is completely distorted. Officially, unemployment is low, but many enterprises practice what is called hidden unemployment. That is, they put people on reduced work weeks with a corresponding drop in income. Wages are cut, sometimes not paid at all, or paid in parallel, and so on. In other words, during the war, Russia has thrown everything out of balance, has ruined everything. And all of this is gradually adding up and is starting to destroy the Russian economy more and more. That's why, as you can see, growth has stopped. What is that? 1%? That's not a serious number. It's within the margin of error. It's like having a meter stick that's calibrated with an accuracy of plus or minus 1 centimeter. So is it 99 or 101? Well, it was made poorly, shoddily. That's exactly what Russian statistics are like. That's why we don't know if there's 1% growth or already more. A 7% decline? Most likely it's a 7% decline. But Putin will never admit that.
In turn, Trump and the United States of America have stated that if you don't stop, if you don't go to peace negotiations, we will strengthen the sanctions. What sanctions can be strengthened? What new ones can be introduced to somehow have an impact? On Putin himself, I don't know, on Russia and so on.
Well, look, Trump, he is absolutely not interested in either Ukraine or ending the war. He simply doesn't care about it. But he is interested in kicking Russia out of the oil market. This has nothing to do with politics. It has everything to do with money, with the interests of American oil companies. That's why he is systematically removing Russia from the global oil market. And he's actually being quite successful at it. Look, no matter what happens in Russia right now, how do both worlds react? It hasn't signed on, and it's very difficult for it to return to the European markets. At best, it could return, but only in a way that's very difficult for it, through American companies. At one time, I already described such a model in an interview. I can repeat it now. It's quite possible that the Americans will bring Russian oil and gas back to the European market, but only under their own terms. In other words, they will become the main buyer of Russian oil and gas and will sell it to Europe as American oil, American gas. And Russia will have to give them a significant share of the revenue as intermediaries, who are facilitating the return. This is something the Americans can do. As a business consultant, I have considered this scenario, and such an opportunity does not exist. But even so, it would still mean huge financial losses for Russia. That's why Trump, of course, is pushing Russia out of the global literary market. Look, he's still putting pressure on India and is starting to move toward reducing imports. He put pressure on Turkey, and Turkey signed an agreement to purchase US LNG. He forced the European Union to sign an agreement, some sort of 5-year oil purchase agreement with the US. So in this sense, he is ruthlessly pushing them out. No matter how he personally feels about Putin, I don't know that, but he's pushing Russia out of the oil market. Russia is a competitor to the American oil industry, and he's going after a foolish, weak competitor who made himself vulnerable. He's pushing him out to take over his markets. That's normal business, and he is capable of doing it. There's something else that can be done. They could start working seriously with the tankers. So far, the work with the Shadow Fleet tankers has been sloppy, weak, and not at all serious. And there are a lot of interesting issues there. For example, it turned out that these tankers are sailing the seas with forged documents. It turned out that when they started looking into where these tankers are registered, they discovered that the majority of what is called Russia's fleet is registered in Gabon. But at the same time, the authorities in Gabon are unaware of this. In other words, forged shipping documents were created, and these vessels are sailing the seas using them. For things like this, you can impose fines or make arrests, but so far, this hasn't been done. Although, as you understand, there are fleets that could do all this work, but so far, they haven't. So, in principle, if there were the will, you could quickly bring them into the Russian fleet, anchor them, take the oil from them, and say, you violated shipping regulations, you are being confiscated, and you won't bring anything to Russia. This is possible, but it's not being done. So, in principle, the opportunities exist, but they are not being used yet.
Well, the Ukrainian armed forces are starting to take advantage of these opportunities. That's right. Yes, just recently. A damaged tanker. Yes.
In Med Sea, this is a very interesting topic. Yes.
Yes. And so far, there's been no visible reaction. And Russia, in principle, can't openly respond. And
what can it do? It's not even a Russian vessel. It's probably sailing under the flag of some country like Gabon. Yeah, right. A Gabonese tanker was damaged in the Mediterranean Sea? What does that have to do with Russia? Yeah, nothing at all.
But it was damaged.
But it was damaged.
It was carrying something after all. Let's hope, as always, for the Ukrainian armed forces in this regard as well. Regarding sanctions again, I wanted to clarify with you once more, is this bipolar behavior, or are these well-planned actions that once again will benefit Trump, for example? I mean, the fact that the US Treasury lifted some sanctions as a goodwill gesture during negotiations, I mean, the sanctions, they were lifted from certain companies and individuals, including those who supply components for the defense sector of the Russian Federation. These are Finnish and Cypriot companies. At the head of them, as I understand it, judging by the surnames, are citizens who are possibly former citizens of the Russian Federation.
Well, once again, Marina, Trump is always playing a game. He snaps his fingers, pokes, and then shows a carrot. He keeps playing this game with Putin, trying to make Putin want the carrot and also be afraid of the stick so that he'll be willing to compromise. This approach doesn't work, but Trump doesn't have any other ideas. He's not exactly rich in ideas. That's why he keeps repeating it over and over. One moment he threatens with sanctions, the next he backs off. Well, how can I put it? There's nothing more inconsistent than Mr. Trump's foreign policy. We've just witnessed it ourselves. He was cracking the whip menacingly over Venezuela, and then let the Venezuelan tanker go so someone could take it further. That's just how it goes. But you see, that's the kind of US president we have. Fortunately, he's not your president, but he does influence the whole world. And the way he is, well, that's pretty much how we see the world around us. That's what makes the situation so troubling.